Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. Like anyone who wants to get views, I understand the value of a top 10 list, and since a lot of other people have top 10 lists when it comes to American presidents, I decided that I too will have a top 10 list of American presidents. However, this is not the 10 best presidents and it's not the 10 worst presidents. What I'm judging the presidents on is their overall impact on the course of American history. So, let me explain my criteria. And before I do that, I want you to check out this graphic. I don't know who made this, but someone started playing some alternate history right around the time of William Howard Taft, and he apparently only cares about the 20th century presidents and beyond, because he didn't really change anything before that. So anyway, let's talk about my criteria for making an impact. This top 10 list is, like all top 10 lists, subjective and opinion-based. However, I do have criteria, and these criteria will give you a good insight into my reasons for holding the opinions that I hold. So, first of all, I'm only looking at the impact these individuals had while they were in the presidency. So, the things that they did before and after, I am not considering at all. I'm looking primarily at the effect that they had on people's daily lives. To me, that is the single most important thing that a president can do, whether for good or for bad, is to change the way that people experience life. And to that end, the way that most presidents have the biggest impact is by instituting major policy changes. These can be major changes in foreign policy or in domestic policy. Another major thing that I think is important is if a president advanced or curtailed freedom in some way, whether it's empowering a new group of voters or passing limitations on rights that people had enjoyed before. Both of those things are very impactful to people's lives and to subsequent events. I also am looking more at the long-term impact of these actions than the short-term impact. I also am looking a little bit at the norms and standards that these people have set and their impact on the nature of their party. So if they had some impact on the way that presidents communicate, that's important, but it's not all that important in the grand scheme of things. And last and also least is if a president was able to change the discourse. Now, discourse is something that really gets a lot of press today because of the popularity of Foucault among historians. However, I think that the importance of discourse does get overplayed quite a bit. And while it does have an impact on politics and on political outcomes, I think that more material factors are actually more important. So, without any further ado, let me show you my runners-up, and I'll explain why they had a big impact, but also why that impact was not big enough to warrant including them in a top 10. So I pictured Jimmy Carter here. Jimmy Carter is actually not an honorable mention for this. However, he is a perfect example of a president who, love him or hate him, had very little impact on American history in the grand scheme of things, since all of his policies and desired outcomes pretty much resulted in either failure or repudiation, much of which was not really his fault. So, let's get into the honorable mentions proper. Theodore Roosevelt. He increased the role of government, and he did have a pretty big impact on people's lives. However, the 1920s called and really rolled back much of what he had accomplished. Also, he was not the most influential progressive, I'll argue. George Washington. Now, this will probably surprise a lot of people, but I actually don't think that George Washington is a top 10 impact president. If you look at the precedents that he set, people focus very heavily on the fact that he only served 2 terms and that he went with the title Mr. President. But beyond that, much of what he did ended up being repudiated by his successors, especially Thomas Jefferson. Washington's original vision for the country, this kind of elitist vision where only men of property were allowed to participate, and you would have a strong government with relatively limited rights for common people, that vision fell apart. And it fell apart pretty spectacularly by, 1800 or so. So really, he didn't have that big of an impact, and also his sort of aloof approach to public affairs really hasn't translated well and wasn't copied by most of his successors. Ronald Reagan, another one that might surprise people. Now, Reagan often gets on these lists and he has a lot of popularity. However, I would argue that while he is a major proponent of neoliberalism and he did help to get that to be a thing, the thing about Reagan that people often ignore is that policy-wise, he failed 95% of the time. The only success that he had was mostly in discourse. But by succeeding in discourse but not policy, what he did is set up other people to accomplish the things that he advocated. He himself really didn't accomplish all that much. Also, his role in ending the Cold War is massively exaggerated. The Soviet Union was on its last legs by the time he came into office, and Gorbachev was reaching out to any American leaders in order to try to make peace and bring the Cold War to an end. If anything, Reagan perpetuated the Cold War unnecessarily. Next up, George W. Bush. Now, Bush has had a massive impact on stuff recently, since he started a couple wars that we haven't gotten ourselves out of, and he made efforts to curtail civil liberties. However, George W. Bush doesn't quite crack the top 10. Actually, of everybody on this list right now, I would actually put him on here above the rest if I had to choose one to be upgraded to the top 10. But another factor for Bush is that it's a little too early to tell exactly how impactful he and his policies will be in the long run. James Monroe, he got us involved in foreign affairs for the first time in a proper sense by passing the Monroe Doctrine, where the U.S. claimed hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. However, the problem with a lot of the early presidents is that presidents back then simply did a lot less than they do now. They had a much smaller field of competency, so the impact that they could have was somewhat limited when compared to modern presidents. James K. Polk, one of the lesser men on this list. However, he did add about half the country, so he deserves some mention if we're talking about someone who had an impact. I'm not sure if he impacted the way that government functioned in any meaningful way, though. Ulysses S. Grant, he helped to set the standard for what a Gilded Age president was. Basically an incompetent buffoon who allowed corporations to run around roughshod. And then Calvin Coolidge, he is sort of a conservative icon. He's what the libertarians look to as an ideal president. And he also is sort of the icon of the 1920s and that whole style of government. The economic doctrines promoted and popularized by people like Calvin Coolidge also helped to lead to the Great Depression and to inspire later right-wing economic views of laissez-faire. So he's basically a discourse guy, and that's why he didn't make the list. So now let's look at the people who did make the list, the people who actually made a tremendous impact on the course of American history through their actions as president. So let's get going. So now to begin the top 10 in earnest. Number 10, Richard Nixon. Nixon, in terms of policy, did a number of really important and consequential things. He founded the EPA. This was largely due to public pressure after the Cuyahoga River caught fire. Not necessarily something that he set out to do, but something that he was more or less forced to do. Despite the efforts of some Republican presidents in the recent past to really gut the EPA, it still does continue to provide a certain measure of environmental protection to people all around the country. Nixon opened up negotiations with China. He visited China. He was the first American president to visit communist China. That was a fairly big deal, and it has set a precedent for meeting with people who the U.S. might not necessarily be on the best terms with. It's a contested legacy, however. Right now, Trump is thinking of meeting with Kim Jong-un, and he's taking heavy flack for it, but I imagine that the precedent he would be drawing on, or at least that his advisors would be drawing on, is Nixon going to China. Politically speaking, if you're talking pure horse race politics, Richard Nixon was the primary architect, or at least the first person to really execute the Southern strategy, which is where the Republicans took the South away from the Democrats by appealing to the grievances of white racists in the South. Now, a lot of this was enabled by the fact that Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats really went all in on the civil rights movement, and that alienated the South. But the Southern strategy more or less explicitly plays that. And one of the really significant things about that is not so much where the votes for the Republicans come from, as that it really started to bring to an end the old era of the New Deal, where what we saw were that you had liberals, moderates, and conservatives in each party. Although there were more liberals in the Democratic Party and more conservatives in the Republican Party, you could have a lot of bipartisanship in Congress because you had different ideologies represented in both parties. And the Southern strategy really starts to shake that out and to basically put all the people on the right in the Republican Party, all the people on the left in the Democratic Party. Or what passes for the left, I guess, we're talking about today. He also really provided a starting point for most of the neoconservatives who were really prominent in American life until about 2008. Right now, most of the people who are neoconservatives in government are the proteges of people who worked for Nixon, but the originals themselves worked for Nixon, Reagan, and then the two Bushes. By his actions with Watergate, Richard Nixon really helped delegitimize the office of president and the government as a whole. Now, while this had immediate negative impact for the Republican Party as they lost the next presidential election to Jimmy Carter, and they also lost control of Congress, I think in the long run, I actually believe that Richard Nixon's failure really helped the Republican Party. And my reason for that is that when the Republicans would say that government is the problem, or that government sucks, because that's really what their message boils down to, from Reagan on, rhetorically, is that the government sucks. And the reason why a lot of people think the government sucks is because they are thinking of the time of Richard Nixon. You know, this guy who was the living embodiment of corruption. So even though he was a Republican, it's easy to forget that and just to look at the entire government as being smeared by what he did. And not to say that his opponents were innocent by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, I think that Nixon actually played a huge role in moving the Republican Party and the country to the right, and in really coloring in a negative way the political perspective of especially the boomer generation. So we really continue to live in the world that Nixon built, although a lot of that impact was completely unintentional. Number 10 was probably a bit of a surprise to a lot of you, and if so, then number 9 is going to be a much bigger surprise. I think that Bill Clinton is the 9th most impactful U.S. president. Under him, what happened is that we went from having a left and a right party to basically a right party and a center-right party. So under Bill Clinton, the Democrats embraced neoliberalism, meaning that more or less the Democrats came to agree with the Republicans on economic issues. And what this means is that Bill Clinton and his followers really worked to do what Reagan had only dreamt of. Ronald Reagan, the reason why he doesn't make this list is because, simply put, he did not succeed in most of his policy objectives. But Bill Clinton did succeed in doing most of the things Reagan wanted to do. So deregulation had started under Reagan, but hadn't really gotten super far because the Democrats in Congress were able to block a lot of what Reagan wanted to do. However, Bill Clinton really pushed for things like repealing Glass-Steagall, which many people think was the primary cause of the 2008 recession, where the banks collapsed. He also had economic policies which really helped to promote growing inequality. For the most part, all Bill Clinton did was cave the Republicans or outright support them. He caved to them on crime, gay marriage, the DOMA Act. Some people have tried to paint that as protecting gay people. That's complete and total bullshit. It basically just gave in to the prejudice that the Republicans were trying to promote. Also, the crime bill that Clinton passed is now notorious. It has a lot of mandatory minimums in it. It allows for privatized prisons. It's been an absolute disaster for the African American community in America. He also really had a chance to create a new post-Cold War foreign policy, and he didn't really succeed in coming up with anything. He did temporarily succeed in cutting the military budget, something for which he earned the ire of a lot of Republicans, but he didn't really come up with anything new or different in terms of his foreign policy. part of that blame also belongs to George Bush the first, since he was in a similar situation and also failed to really formulate a new foreign policy. And although this was not a direct action that he performed, for whatever reason, Bill Clinton really brought out the worst in the right wing, and it was due to his person, being a former pot-smoking hippie from the 60s. He really managed to alienate the right wing in America, and this is a time when the right wing was becoming increasingly conspiratorial and setting the stage for the real crazies that we know today, like Alex Jones. So under Bill Clinton, what we saw is that Fox News got its start, basically pushing the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and Rush Limbaugh got his start talking about Bill Clinton and the pear-shaped men running the White House. So that was Bill Clinton's impact. It continues to be felt. Most of what we saw happen under Bush, like the major recession, and then under Obama, where he tried and failed to push for health care and then just coasted the rest of the way. All of that was set into motion by Bill Clinton's taking over of the Democratic Party and converting it into the Republican Light Party. Coming in at the 8th spot is our 7th president, Andrew Jackson. His Indian Removal Act remains one of America's most controversial and largely denounced policy initiatives of all time. This led to the Trail of Tears, and many people consider this to be a genocide against Native Americans. This is something that really makes you question the morality of the first few generations of American statesmen. And it really is just a dark mark on America that will most likely never come clean. Andrew Jackson's economic policies were designed to be somewhat populist, but ultimately he got rid of the national bank in favor of private banks, so he had populist rhetoric and service of private interests, something we've seen happen over and over and over, especially in recent history. And ultimately, that really set back economic developments by a couple of decades, since one of the positive things that a national bank can do is finance large-scale infrastructure. He also passed the Tenure of Office Act, and in theory, what this was to do is to establish public oversight over all government officials, but it also had the impact of creating a spoils system where presidents would appoint campaign contributors and other political lackeys to office. So it looks like Jackson actually did have a positive intent with this, but even under his own time in his 2 terms, he began just appointing his cronies. So this was a reform act which ended up backfiring, and it would take quite a long time for the spoils system to really be reformed. That would be something that the progressive presidents would take on. And even now, though, we still see that the spoils system is a real thing when candidates will give away offices to their primary opponents that they're grossly unqualified for. Examples being Obama appointing Hillary as a Secretary of State, or Trump using Ben Carson for the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, things that neither one of them should have ever been associated with. Andrew Jackson is also the first president to establish the precedent of using federal power to keep states in line and in the Union. This is called the nullification crisis, where South Carolina basically said they weren't going to follow a federal law that they didn't like, and he threatened to use federal force. You could also make a case that maybe Washington was the first person to kind of do that when he led troops during the Whiskey Rebellion, but this was the first sort of legal precedent rather than just a precedent based on personal leadership. The most important thing that Jackson did, other than the Indian Removal Act, something that had a very positive impact, is that he did away with property requirements for voting. And now we had universal white male suffrage, starting with Andrew Jackson. And that seems like a small step when we look back, but it was arguably the most important step on the path to universal suffrage for all adult citizens in America. Because that was really where the old vision of an elite-driven America of property owners fell apart, and we started moving towards a more democratic and inclusive vision. And ironically, Andrew Jackson, of course, being super anti-Indian and, pretty openly racist, is the guy who ultimately sets the stage by helping white men of helping all men and later women to gain the vote. So, pretty big impact, and despite the fact he was, a pretty regrettable person, his one act of expanding suffrage means that he's had a massive impact on our history. In the 7th slot is our 3rd president, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson did a number of very important things that often go overlooked. So, the thing is, because a lot of people really hold up Washington as being the greatest president or one of the top 3 presidents, they forget that his vision was overturned early and completely. And the person who did the most to overturn that vision was Thomas Jefferson. One of the first things that he did in terms of tone is that he radically changed the way that the president presented himself to the public. When people would come to visit the White House, rather than going through elaborate ceremonies the way that Washington and Adams had, Jefferson often didn't dress up, and he just kind of acted in a familiar way with whoever was visiting. So he personalized and humanized the presidency. Modern presidents would behave a lot more like Jefferson, and that's what our expectation is. He also changed direction from Washington and Adams on issues of personal liberty. Adams took it a lot further than Washington had by passing the Alien and Sedition Act, and it seems more or less like if we had to characterize Washington and Adams, they would be the kind of people who would support something very much like the Patriot Act, and they weren't all that big on the rights of individuals. They were more about the necessity of the state. Whereas Jefferson is the opposite. He's somewhat more interested in promoting individual liberties and really upholding the Bill of Rights. So it's a massive shift in focus, and it probably has a pretty big impact. Washington and Adams also flirted with things like censorship and a lot of things that Jefferson reversed on that were pretty damn important. Jefferson's overall vision of America as an agrarian republic and his ideal of egalitarianism was also something that really caught fire with a lot of Americans and would really inform political discourse for a long time. Of course, Andrew Jackson, who we just talked about, would really take this vision and run with it, and that is ultimately where this idea of universal white male suffrage came from. Jefferson also led America in its first ever foreign war. Americans were being impressed by Barbary pirates in North Africa, so he enabled an ambassador named William Eaton to raise mercenaries and fight the pirates, which is an interesting story unto itself. One thing that he's really well known for is making the Louisiana Purchase. He bought basically doubled the territory of the United States with a relatively cheap land purchase from the French. Napoleon needed money, and the U.S. settlers needed places to go, so it kind of worked out. And then Jefferson, being a naturalist and intellectual, decided to commission 2 explorers named Lewis and Clark to make an expedition through this new territory, map it out, and report back on what was there. During Jefferson's presidency, this is when the famous Burr versus Hamilton duel was fought. Hamilton died. A lot of people really commemorate Hamilton, but they forget, 1, he was a monarchist, and 2, he was the guy who really pressed Washington and Adams to fight against personal liberties. So no loss there, honestly. We didn't lose shit when we lost Hamilton. Anyway, Burr launched a conspiracy. He tried to overthrow the U.S. government, but this conspiracy was foiled. It probably had no real chance anyway, but Jefferson was the guy who helped foil that. And it's one of the few attempts that I'm aware of to overthrow the U.S. government. He also managed to keep America neutral in the Napoleonic Wars, and the Louisiana Purchase was actually a part of that deed, so it ended up being a beneficial deed. Later on, Madison will get us involved in the Napoleonic Wars by fighting the War of 1812. And if we look at how we ended up siding more or less with the French by logical deduction, then we can attribute that to Jefferson, since he made a relationship with Napoleon and was able to purchase Louisiana on sale. In the 6th slot is Dwight David Eisenhower. He ended the Korean War. that was not all that big of a deal. The war was starting to peter down anyway. One of Eisenhower's most important decisions was, rather than spending astronomical sums of money on our military, he decided that we would instead spend a moderate sum and focus on establishing a nuclear deterrence. This is the origin of the mutually assured destruction doctrine, or MAD. During his time as president, Eisenhower used his military experience to hold back the hawks and to point out that a nuclear war would be disastrous, and also that we are ahead of the Soviets in terms of technology and in terms of nuclear capabilities. However, despite the fact that he mostly held back the hawks at the Pentagon, he did unleash the CIA, and this set a very negative precedent of the U.S. intervening in Latin America and overthrowing lawfully elected governments. One thing that he did that had a positive impact and made the 50s, 60s, and 70s relatively tranquil in terms of domestic politics, at least in Congress. People remember this period as being tumultuous due to the hippie movement and the anti-war movement for Vietnam. But in terms of how people got along in Congress, we didn't see a lot of government shutdowns or anything like that. Eisenhower basically just gave in and accepted the New Deal. Republicans before him actually had been trying to roll back the New Deal and get back to the 20s, but Eisenhower said, no, it's working, it's established, and, we won't be able to win an election against Democrats if we're against something that the entire population supports. So Eisenhower's acceptance of the New Deal really helped to maintain things like Social Security going forward. His signature piece of legislation, and something that I'm sure anyone who's visited the U.S. will have utilized, is the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. Originally, he sort of planned this back when he was an Army officer in the 20s, and it took forever to cross America based on the random and chaotic state highway system. So these interstate highways had the function of making it easy to move troops across America, but mostly they've been really good for commerce and for travel. So if you've ever had a long road trip across the country and it wasn't a complete pain in the ass to figure out how to do it, then you can thank Dwight Eisenhower. One thing that he did that sort of started a new precedent, which moved away from previous presidential approaches, is that he had an aloof stance when it came to dealing with other politicians, and he also refused to engage in what he called personality politics. So he would never address his political opponents by name. He thought that that was beneath the dignity of the office. So, for instance, when the McCarthy scare was going on, Eisenhower's private opinion was a bit controversial, but he was somewhat against what McCarthy was doing. Now, he did want to hunt out communists, but he wasn't necessarily someone who would just go without evidence and shoot off at the hip. However, because of his policy of being aloof, he would never just say McCarthy needs to, tone it down. So basically, McCarthy was able to ruin the careers of a lot of bureaucrats and to stoke public fear for, a solid 3 or 4 years until he was destroyed on national television. And Eisenhower had very little to do with that. Had he stepped in earlier, it's possible that he could have undone a lot of that damage. Also, the Civil Rights Movement, part of the reason why it didn't really get underway until the 60s is that Eisenhower was silent on this issue. He didn't really say a whole lot, and in private, he would make remarks that indicated that he was against the Civil Rights Movement. He also had some resistance to a Supreme Court hearing, the one that ended up allowing for desegregated schools. However, he did enforce it, even though he didn't want to. For him, it was an embarrassment to have to intervene. He actually warned Arkansas's governor about this, but the governor persisted in blocking black students from entering the school, so Eisenhower had to nationalize the state National Guard there. So he gets some credit for being a civil rights president in that one area, but it's really undeserved. All he was doing is asserting federal authority on that case. So had he taken a stance, the history of the civil rights movement would be a lot different one way or the other. Number 5 in terms of impact is Harry S. Truman from Missouri. When he first left office, Truman was deeply despised, and in recent years he's been rehabilitated. Although I think the pendulum is starting to swing once again to considering him a bad president if Oliver Stone's untold story of the U.S. is to be believed. So, why is he so controversial? Well, first of all, Harry Truman is the only leader in world history, much less American history, to use atomic weapons. He, of course, gave the order to drop the atomic bombs on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. There's some controversy as to whether this was necessary to end the war. Some people believe that Japan was on the verge of surrendering anyway. And there is a lot of evidence that Truman simply had a visceral hatred of Japan. After the war, when Douglas MacArthur requested food aid to Japan, Truman actually said to let the Japanese starve, so MacArthur had to go behind his back and feed the Japanese people to prevent a starvation. Truman also contributed heavily to the start of the Cold War. A lot of this also lies with Churchill, and of course Stalin for being a paranoid weirdo. But between the three of them, they created an atmosphere of distrust among one another, and the actions taken during the Truman administration will set up the basic parameters of U.S.-Soviet relations from approximately 1945 until the breakup of the USSR in like 1991. So in foreign policy, of course, he was very influential for that. The nuclear arms race, all of that kind of stuff, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, which is a tremendously important thing. This was the rebuilding of Western Europe. NATO forms under Truman's leadership. The UN really gets underway. His impact on foreign policy is not to be underestimated. In fact, of all the presidents that I can think of, no one has had more of an impact on U.S. foreign policy over a long period of time than Harry Truman. So if we look at his domestic policy, some things that are a little less well known. So from the start of his administration, he was in a nonstop battle with the Republicans over the New Deal. In 1946, Republicans retook control of Congress, and one of their things they wanted to do was really to roll back the government to pre-FDR times and do away with most of the provisions of the New Deal, including Social Security. So Truman had to fight tooth and nail. The biggest defeat that he suffered as president was in 1947 when Senator Taft of Ohio and another senator named Hartley passed the Taft-Hartley Act. And what this did was it banned all of the popular and effective tactics that labor unions would use to gain rights and benefits. So things like wildcat strikes, sit-in strikes, all those things were banned. And this didn't immediately have a negative impact on unions. Unions would continue to flourish through the 1970s. But ultimately, when outsourcing would really get underway in the 70s and then in the 80s and 90s, unions had no real recourse to fight back. And it was because of the Taft-Hartley Act. So that was something which was a long-term detriment to the Democrats. And it's also a large part of the reason why a lot of the neoliberal Democrats decided to abandon unions and just become a corporate party, because unions, because of the limitations imposed on them by Taft-Hartley, are no longer able to raise money on a level that's anywhere comparable to what corporations can raise. And of course, this was passed over Truman's objection because he understood that unions were key to the Democratic Party. That being said, he also did have some clashes with unions in 1946 when there was a large-scale strike, and he threatened to draft everybody who was striking into the army. Truman laid out a policy objective called the Fair Deal, which was a successor to the New Deal that never really got underway. Most of the things he tried to do failed, but it did establish some basic goals for Democrats that Democrats still identify with on some level. Even if the party leadership has abandoned those things, most average Democrats still believe in expanding civil rights and in promoting a national health care system. So Truman had a massive impact on American history. It's really hard to say whether it was more good or more bad, but at any rate, it was tremendous. Number 4 in terms of impact is Abraham Lincoln. And I had to think long and hard about putting very many people ahead of Lincoln, so hopefully I will make a good case for those people. Lincoln's impact on American history is profound and obvious. So when he was first elected, his election and his reputation as someone who was an abolitionist caused the South to secede. Now his reputation for being an abolitionist was almost certainly massively exaggerated, but the South had reached a fever pitch of paranoia when it came to protecting their peculiar institution. And then Lincoln was faced with the greatest challenge in American history, preserving the Union when half the Union broke away. And not to mention that he had been personally undermined by the fact that his election was the immediate catalyst for that secession. So, pretty damn difficult challenge. And of course, in the end, he ended the institution of slavery and saved the Union. So, those are contributions which are very hard to surpass in terms of the impact that they had on future American history. His Gettysburg Address is also the standard for presidential addresses. No other speech comes anywhere close to it in terms of being immediately recognizable or influential. Lincoln did some things that expanded federal power. Most of those were war measures, and a lot of them, fell into abeyance after the end of the war. Nonetheless, this was one of the major steps in expanding the power of the federal government that eventually led to the creation of the federal government as we know it today. One other factor that a lot of people maybe underestimate, since Lincoln tends to be the object of hero worship, is that he actually was a pretty bad commander-in-chief. He didn't really do a great job of selecting generals and approving strategies. And a lot of the political generals who he kept appointing to things, like Benjamin Butler and Nathaniel Banks, were perpetual failures. Lincoln also had an obsession, it seems, with finding a Republican general to make into the ultimate victor of the war. There were a few people who he might have been able to ride to victory. Rosecrans, Buell, and George Thomas all come to mind as very capable commanders who Lincoln held back in order to promote Grant and Sherman. And ultimately, he did win the war, but he could have possibly won quicker had he been less concerned with the politics of it. At any rate, though, Lincoln had a pretty big impact, but I actually think that there are three people who have had more of an impact on the daily lives of Americans and the course of American history. So let's go on to them. Number 3 in terms of impact is Woodrow Wilson. Right now it's mid-March, so for the next month we'll be in the midst of tax season. And the only reason why there is a tax season for most Americans is because of Woodrow Wilson and the implementation of the income tax. So that's something that has had a pretty obvious impact. And all presidents since Wilson have dealt with tax policy, adjusting rates and all of that, and trying to figure out what economic impact different tax rates have. Not to mention that cutting people's taxes tends to win their support, so you have to balance out winning popularity by cutting taxes with producing enough revenue and thinking about the impact that different tax plans have on the overall economy. So that's been something that has been a consideration since Wilson was president. Wilson also passed the Federal Reserve Act, which has had a major impact on American financial policy. Of course, if you asked a libertarian what the most important event in American history was, they might actually say the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, because that apparently was the beginning of the end of the Republic. Of course, I'm making fun of libertarians because I think they're ridiculous, but let's move on. Also, he is responsible for some antitrust measures. TR and Taft both did antitrust things as well. However, Wilson's tended to stick a little bit more. He also created the Federal Trade Commission, which helped to regulate Wall Street and banks. The FTC still exists. It often gets neutered by Republican presidents or by neoliberal Democrats, but it has done some good work since Wilson founded it, here and there. Under Wilson, this is when the progressive movement was really at its peak. TR and Taft had both been somewhat progressive Republicans. I say somewhat because of Taft. He really was more of a moderate, certainly not a conservative, though. With Wilson, we see that Democrats also went progressive, and because of Wilson, Democrats would stay progressive, and steadily progressives would filter out of the Republican Party and filter into the Democratic Party. So Wilson, in his election, was really a key factor in getting the Democrats to move to the left side of the spectrum. So this is a major realignment moment, the presidency of Wilson. Wilson did have some dark spots on his record. The one that's well known is that he did away with the requirement that Teddy Roosevelt had started, where the civil service was required to hire a certain number of black people. So basically, Wilson just got rid of all the black people in the federal bureaucracy. And that's one of the big stains on his record. He was pretty openly racist. He also allowed a screening of Birth of a Nation, which was a kind of Klan perspective on the Civil War. He also utilized sedition laws that he passed during World War I in order to crush the IWW, the Wobblies, which was a major union, and they opposed the war on the grounds that workers in one country shouldn't fight wars against other nations and their workers. The Wobblies never fully recovered from this, and ultimately that probably had a major impact on the political future of America and prevented America from going further to the left than it ended up going. Wilson also is the primary architect of the League of Nations. Ultimately, the United States did not join the League, but it formed because of Wilson and his speaking tour. So he had a major impact in that regard. But a mood of isolationism broke out in America after World War I. Wilson also ran on the promise to keep America out of the war. He managed to keep us out of the war during his first term. However, we got involved during the second term. And one other important thing that he did militarily is that he really spent a lot of time training and equipping the U.S. Expeditionary Force before they went abroad. He also fought a war against Mexico, or more properly against Pancho Villa. That was a fairly big event at the time. Even if it hasn't really gone down as something that's been all that impactful for Americans, it definitely was impactful for Mexico. He also is the guy who really pushes the idea of the United States spreading democracy. So while that idea does not really resonate with his contemporaries, this is something that was taken up during the Cold War period and later by people like Bush and Obama and Trump. So this is something that has had a long life, even if it took a while to get going. And of course, under Wilson, even though he was partly paralyzed by this point and not all that active, 2 constitutional amendments passed. Both of them were pretty important. One was prohibition. This was in response to what was seen as an alcohol crisis in America. And the second was women's suffrage, which has stuck, and women have had the right to vote since 1920. Due in part to Woodrow Wilson, although his personal role in that was fairly small. At the least, though, he did not stand in the way, and this was one of the major steps forward in really empowering all American adults to partake in the political process. Number 2 in terms of impact is Lyndon Baines Johnson. So first of all, let's cover the negative part of his legacy, namely his escalation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Now, without Johnson and his belief in the domino theory, it's possible that someone else could have been in office and maybe not gotten us as deeply involved in Vietnam. After all, it was a French problem originally, and, the U.S. didn't have to get involved. However, because of factors dating back to the Truman administration, this whole domino theory had become prevalent among the leadership of both parties, and Johnson thought that if he didn't stop the spread of communism in Vietnam, that it would just have a domino effect all across the Pacific and really endanger American interest. Vietnam ultimately had a major social impact in America. It divided people in the Democratic Party. It divided Americans across all spectrums of life, across generations. The greatest generation, which still thought of war in terms of World War II, didn't understand that many people in the younger generation didn't approve of the war and thought that it was a dumb war. It really created a lot of issues. I would say in many ways, like this whole idea of there being distinctive generations gets a lot of its ammunition from the divides exposed by the Vietnam War. Not to mention that a whole lot of leaders who emerged for both the Democrats and the Republicans emerged from the context of this big debate over Vietnam. A lot of those leaders are still with us, and unfortunately most of them have turned out to be shit. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, one other major thing that Lyndon Johnson did, which has mostly been a negative thing, is that he is the guy who was given the Presidential War Powers Act. And this is the act that enables American presidents to more or less make war without a declaration of war. Now, Vietnam required that. We never declared war on Ho Chi Minh. But we still got involved. And we were there for years and years. There have been some limits placed on this that I think it's like you have 60 or 90 days when the president deploys troops before he has to get funding from Congress to keep them wherever he put them. Usually that funding is more or less a given since no one wants to be against the troops. So most of the interventions that we've done since the 1960s we can in large part credit to Johnson's Presidential War Powers Act. On the positive side, Johnson also did a lot of stuff. If anything, I'd say that he is the most active of all American presidents in terms of really putting his thumb in every pie. Johnson helped pass the Civil Rights Act. Now, he worked hand in hand with MLK, and more or less the agreement was that MLK had to get the movement popularized, and then Johnson would carry it through Congress. He was a veteran senator, and he knew how to get people to vote. He often used bully tactics to do it, and he was probably the most successful president at using the bully pulpit to get what he wanted. That included showing people his penis and things like that. He's not a president who could possibly survive today, but he was very effective in his own time. His signature legislation was Medicare and Medicaid, Medicare being for old people, Medicaid being for the poor. He wasn't able to pass a universal health care system, but these two pieces of legislation are the most significant pieces of legislation ever passed on health care, and they make Obamacare look like the sham that it really is. Lyndon Johnson also passed welfare, which is a way to keep people fed and housed when they are unemployed. In general, this was all part of his war on poverty. Johnson, who came from a really impoverished part of Texas, wanted to end poverty in America, and he had full faith in the power of the American government to do that. So between his war powers and his domestic policy, which was to end poverty, Johnson was kind of the stereotypical liberal who wanted to solve everything with government. He was very much the face of big government in his own time. Even though his name doesn't really have a lot of recognition today among people who didn't live under Johnson. His administration really was the illustration of what big government was in both a good and a bad way. And another thing to note about his war on poverty is that the institutions which are still around, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, these things still do help a lot of people, even if they have been largely gutted by his successors. And until the war on poverty was declared over by Ronald Reagan, it actually had reduced the poverty rate in America fairly significantly. Maybe not as much as Johnson and his supporters would have hoped, but it did have an impact, and that impact was largely positive. The number one American president in terms of his impact on your daily life, without a doubt, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The most important legislation in American history that has had the biggest enduring impact and has caused the most controversy in terms of expanding, contracting, or maintaining it is the New Deal. The New Deal, of course, was maintained by Truman. We already talked about that. Johnson's War on Poverty was largely just an expansion of the New Deal. And a lot of what presidents from Reagan on, especially Clinton, Obama, and Trump, have tried to do is to really cut back on the New Deal. The New Deal has been basically the backbone of American society. The prosperity that the New Deal created is really the basis of the American dream. The idea of owning your own home, having a career where you work a reasonable number of hours and still are able to provide for your family, send your kids to college, all that kind of stuff. All of that is a product of New Deal era legislation. Roosevelt inherited a crisis second only to that of Abraham Lincoln. The country was in the middle of the worst depression in its entire history, a global depression, and he managed throughout that time to keep radical elements on both the left and the right, i.e. communist and fascist, in check. And his reforms saved capitalism. Now, some people have labeled him a socialist. However, clearly the world of the New Deal coalition, the world from Roosevelt's election in 1932 all the way until about 1980, clearly that is a capitalist world. So unless you have a really weird definition of what socialism is, Franklin Roosevelt saved capitalism. His most important signature piece of legislation, the crown jewel of the New Deal, is Social Security. This is one of the real bedrock institutions in America. This is something that protects old people from dying of starvation during their old age when they're no longer able to work. This was something that was really well tailored toward the American mindset at the time. It was called an earned benefit. It's only been in recent years that Republicans have really perverted the language around Social Security and labeled it an entitlement to make the old people who worked for 40 years and earned it seem like they are brats. At any rate, it's an earned benefit. Your benefits are proportional to your earnings. It is not a socialist institution. The main thing that Roosevelt did, also beyond his impact on just your daily life, is he really expanded the role of the federal government. Now, because of this, he's not very popular with, say, libertarians, but this is something that has a long-term impact, and it's really hard to imagine the things that the government has done since World War II without Roosevelt's expansion of the competency of the federal government during his time in office. He really was key to our victory in World War II. And I think a lot of people really underestimate his role because they primarily think of him as being the New Deal guy, and they think of Churchill more associated with World War II. But the thing is, Churchill was an idiot. If you really look at what Churchill wanted to do, the guy was a complete moron. He wanted to really divert Allied resources into invading Eastern Europe to head off the Soviets rather than liberating France. If you think about the logistics of maintaining a U.S. and British force in the Balkans, it would be a nightmare compared to invading from across the English Channel. And logistics really do determine a lot of the success or failure of a war. For Roosevelt, despite the fact that the American public hated Japan and was more or less indifferent to Germany a lot of times, ensured that a Europe-first focus would be what America ended up doing. And that was important because a lot of people believed that the Germans were getting close to developing nuclear weapons. Ultimately, they actually had abandoned their atomic program in favor of missile programs, but no one knew that for quite a while. At any rate, Roosevelt was really important for getting the American public behind a victory strategy and also for inspiring the public to make sacrifices such as, people not eating meat as much at home, so that way soldiers would have some rationing, all kinds of things that he really helped to inspire people to do that a lesser president would have had a lot of trouble getting people to do. And because he was so damn successful and so popular, during the time of Harry Truman, the Republicans passed the 22nd Amendment, which limited presidents to 2 terms. So it was only then that Washington's precedent of serving 2 terms became law. Roosevelt famously was elected 4 times, and he died early in his 4th term of heart failure. So, anyway, that's my list of the most impactful presidents. As I said earlier, this is largely subjective, and it's a top 10 list, so don't take it too seriously if you disagree. If you do disagree, then let me know in the comments, and we'll talk about it. So, until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I encourage you all to keep being involved in history.